Today you will read two fables. First you will read to understand what happens. Then you'll read to analyze by comparing and contrasting the fables. Let's talk about the dog and his reflection. So what is a reflection? Good. A reflection is a mirror image of something. And we know a little bit about reflections in water and how they're distorted, sometimes making images larger. We've got the swollen fox. Swollen meaning if you broke your finger or jammed your finger might be swollen. It might be bigger than it previously was before. So I want you to go ahead and pause this video. Read these two stories to yourself. That's our first read. And then come back to this video. Hey guys, welcome back. So you've read through this story once, or actually both stories. Let me ask you, why does the dog drop his bone? That's right, he sees a reflection of what he thinks is a bigger bone. Second question, what happens to the dog at the end of the story? That's right, he loses the bone he had and almost loses his life too. Third question, how does the fox become swollen? Good, he eats too much of the food that he finds. And the last question, what is the fox doing at the end of the story? Good, he is stuck in the tree waiting to shrink back down to size. So at this time, before our second read, we usually talk about vocabulary words that you thought you may want to talk about because you weren't sure of the meaning. What I'm going to do is read this out loud. I'm going to stop and talk about the words that I thought that you may have chosen words to discuss with the class about. So I highlighted those words already. And I'm just going to go ahead and stop and talk about them in context. So we can practice figuring out vocabulary words in context to figure out those meanings. So here we go. The dog and his reflection. A dog to whom the butcher had thrown a bone was hurrying home with his prize as fast as he could go. As he crossed the narrow footbridge, so I've got footbridge. I don't know what that is. Let me keep reading. He happened to look down and saw himself reflected in the quiet water as if in a mirror. But the greedy dog thought he saw a real dog. Let's back up to footbridge. As he crossed the narrow footbridge, he happened to look down and saw himself reflected in the quiet water. If there's water down there, there must be some sort of river or stream. He's crossing it. I recognize the word bridge. And the dog is walking. I know dogs don't drive cars, so he must be walking on foot or his paws. So I'm going to think that footbridge is some sort of bridge that someone uses to cross over the other side of the river. And not just a real dog, a dog carrying a bone much bigger than his own. If he stopped to think, the dog would have known better. But instead of thinking, he dropped his bone and sprang at the dog he saw in the river. I just love the way that sprang was used, describing, that verb describing how the dog is moving. And it gives you that visual, that sense of urgency. So he sprang at the dog he saw in the river. To his great surprise, he found himself swimming for dear life to reach the shore. At last, he managed to scramble out. Again, I liked scramble because it gave me a better visual in my brain about how the dog was acting at this time. He was a little bit panicked. As he stood sadly thinking about the good bone he had lost, he realized what a stupid dog he had been. Now, my close reader habits also wanted me to give a key detail about how each character's greed is shown. In The Dog and His Reflection, I think this sentence fits that, and not just a real dog, a dog carrying a bone much bigger than his own. So let's go ahead and talk about the swollen fox. I'm going to read it out loud. I'm going to stop again and talk about these highlighted words. Also, we'll go ahead and talk about the detail that proves greed in the swollen fox story. So, a hungry fox found in a hollow tree a quantity of bread and meat. Quantity just means amount, an amount of something. It doesn't say a large quantity or a small quantity, but it's usually used describing a larger quantity of something. So he found an amount of bread and meat, which some shepherds had hidden there for later use. So let's back up to shepherds. Shepherds are people who look after the sheep or a herd of animals, and they usually stay out in the fields. So you can imagine that these people, these shepherds, use the things around them like a hollow tree to hide things or stash things so animals wouldn't be able to get into it. And what does hollow mean? Good. Hollow means that it's empty inside. It's empty inside. So there might be the outer shell of the tree. Maybe you've seen a hollow tree before and you can think about what that tree looks like right now. Let's go back to the story. Delighted with his find, the fox slipped in through the narrow aperture and greedily devoured it all. I thought this sentence was full of words, and I also thought this sentence was an example of the character, the animal's greed. I like delighted. What does delighted mean? Well, does it have a negative or positive connotation? You can imagine he's a hungry fox and he found food. We're thinking that he's happy. This word is definitely a positive sort of word. And delighted means with great pleasure. Aperture. Aperture. How could we figure out what aperture means at the context? We look at aperture. It says a narrow aperture, and we can look back at hollow tree because we know that the fox is slipping into the tree where he found the bread and meat. So aperture might mean a small hole. Let me fit in that word in the sentence. He says, the fox slipped in through the narrow hole and greedily devoured it all. I think hole fits in well there. Greedily. I know that ly is makes this word an adjective. And an adjective tells me that somebody's doing something in some sort of way. So it looks like devoured. I think that has to do something with eating. But eating it with quickly, maybe messy, and greedily, he's very selfish. He has a selfish desire to eat this food. He devours the food in a greedy way. That's what that ly means. But when he tried to get out again, he found himself so swollen after his big meal that he could not squeeze through the hole. Distraught, he fell to the whining and groaning over his misfortune. Distraught. Imagine how you would feel if you realized you couldn't get out of the place where you just stole all of the food. And you're thinking any minute now you're going to be caught. Distraught. We can think that he is upset. This is a negative connotation. And we can also use the words whining and groaning. Usually when we talk about whining and groaning, that's a negative connotation. So we can figure out that this word distraught means something negative. He is extremely sad. Extremely sad. He fell to whining and groaning over his misfortune. And I love the word misfortune. He was lucky when he came across this bread and meat. and unlucky when he got so swollen from all that food. He couldn't get out. Paragraph 2, another fox happening to pass that way came and asked him what the matter was. On learning what had happened, the second fox said, "Well, my friend, I see nothing for it but for you to stay where you are. Soon you'll shrink to your former size, and then you'll get out then easily enough." Former meaning earlier, or his before size, so the size he entered the tree at, not the size he's trying to exit the tree. So he's just got to wait. Former being the first, or it came earlier. So let's talk about the reading strategy. Actually, the graphic organizer. If you were taking last week's teacher assigned lesson, you could use a Venn diagram just like this to compare and contrast those stories. So remember, a Venn diagram tells us how two items are alike and how they're different. And we're always going to put that alike in the circles that are touchy, that are together. So we know the genre is a fable, the topic is animals, and we know now from the theme, or reading these two, that the theme may be regretting being too greedy. So let's take a look at the differences. Let's start with the dog and his reflection. The question is, how does each story approach the topic of greed? We know that greed means to be selfish and have it all for yourself. So first I need to think about how the character's actions are greedy. So in the dog and his reflection, in the story, the dog has a bone, then he crosses a footbridge and thinks he sees a bigger bone in the water below him. He jumps into the water to get that bone, which isn't really there, and he loses the bone he has in the process. I'm going to summarize this beneath the correct title on the Venn diagram. Here's the dog and his reflection, and there I have already pre-written in our thoughts. I'm going to do the same thing for the swollen fox. So if I look back into the story, I can find that the character finds some food in a hollow tree and eats so much that he can't get out of the tree. I'm going to add this to the other side of the Venn diagram. I'm also going to talk about that nobody could even help him, and he has to wait until he shrinks down to his former size. So here we have this Venn diagram comparing and contrasting how the stories are the same and how they're different. They're both about the topic of greed, but they approach that topic a little bit differently. So let's go ahead and put this Venn diagram, put our notes into a short response. And here you go. You love your short responses, don't you? And as you can see, I ran out of space. You are very used to running out of space, because when we answer our prompt, we are making sure that we are answering the question. We're citing. We're using two different sources. So we're also using multiple sources to cite information. So let's go ahead and see. I went ahead and pre-wrote this to save for time. It says both fables. There's both, that great transition word. My marker is running out of ink. Let me try pink. I'm a poet and didn't know it. So both fables warn readers about the negative outcomes of greed, but they do so with different characters, settings, and events. So, how does each fable develop the topic of greed? First, we're going to talk about what was the same. Both fables warn readers about the negative outcomes of greed, but they do it differently. So, let's talk about in The Dog and His Reflection. There's my citation. And I have to pick out that example of him being greedy. So I'm going to say in The Dog and His Reflection, a dog nearly drowns because he wants a bigger bone. He also loses the bone he has by dropping it in the river. So that's how The Dog and His Reflection developed the topic of greed. In The Swollen Fox, they developed the topic of greed by telling a story about a fox that gets stuck in a hole in a tree because he has eaten too much. Even his friend can't help him. Both animals regret their actions and realize too late that they shouldn't have been so greedy.